英語会話。
Hello everyone, welcome to our English conversation program. How are you? I hope you're fine. Since this is Saturday, I'd like to invite you to join us for the guest hour. Here with us is Michael Barclay, whose voice is familiar to you all, I'm sure.
Hello everyone, this is Beth Higgins. It's nice to be back. I hope you enjoy listening to Michael. He's a lecturer in English at the Science University of Tokyo, not to mention one of the regular assistants on this program.
I'm delighted to be able to get hold of you for this interview, Michael, as I understand you were leaving for England before too long. Thank you for coming to talk to us.
Not at all. The pleasure is all mine. Hello, Beth. It's nice to meet you. And I must say it's a great privilege to be the guest here today.
Okay, I'd like to begin by asking where you were born and grew up. I hear you were not born in England, though I understand you are a genuine English gentleman.
I can't answer about the part about being a gentleman. But yes, you're right. I wasn't born in England. I was born in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, many miles away.
May I ask why your family was living there?
My father was working for the army at the time, and it was at the time just after the independence of Malaysia from Britain. I think that was in 1957 or something. I'm not very good at history. But I think my father was helping them train the troops and having that transition stage. So that's where I came into this world.
When you left Malaysia, how old were you?
Well, that's a sad thing. I think I was about 1. I don't remember anything, but I was very young.
And then what are some of the things you do remember from your early life overseas?
Well, I don't remember anything about Malaysia, I'm afraid, but after going back to England, I stayed in England for 3 or 4 years, and then went out to live in Thailand. Again, my father was working in Bangkok for about 3 years. So at that time I was about 6, 7 and 8, that kind of age, and I think I remember it fairly well. I think at that age you tend to take things for granted. You take them in your stride. You don't really appreciate how different things are. And the good thing is you have no prejudices. Everything just comes totally naturally. But I must say I was rather shocked at some of the strange animals I came across for the first time. I remember seeing a snake once in the garden, and that was rather frightening experience.
Was it a big one?
It was fairly big. I remember I pointed out to the family, and no one would believe me. They thought I was a little boy joking, and they looked out, and there was this brown thing, and it wasn't moving. They thought it was just a root of a tree. And of course, when they looked away, it moved, so they didn't see it move. So I was getting very excited. But anyway, they got rid of that eventually. But other things like centipedes and lizards, these are all rather exciting things. But as I say, I think at that age, everything's just great fun. And you don't appreciate it, you just enjoy it, I think.
Well, I suppose that the listeners are wondering about your school life. So then, did you go to school in Thailand, or?
I went to school for a couple of years in Thailand, to an international school. But then at the tender age of 8, I was sent back to England to go to a boarding school. So I had to fly back to England and stay away from home for 3 months or so.
Do you mean that you went to a boarding school in England?
That's right, yes. At that age, it was called a prep school, preparatory school. And that's from the age of about 8 to 13, I think. And then after that, I went to a public school at the age of 13. But by that stage, my parents were back in England, so, you know, we lived in England at that age.
So while you were at boarding school as a young child in England, how many months at a time were you apart from your family?
Each term was 3 months, about. But in fact, my parents went back to England at the end of my second term, so I really only had one spell that long away from home.
I see.
I only went back to Thailand for just one holiday. I think it was a Christmas holiday.
So you mean that you went to a British public school, which is purely a private school?
Yes, I don't know if our listeners know, but a public school is a bit of a misnomer. It's actually a private school, and mine was in the depths of Sussex, miles from any of the nearest towns. But it was a beautiful, beautiful countryside. I really enjoyed it, actually. And I think it made me quite independent, being thrown away from home on your own at that age. But I look back on it, and I think I really enjoyed it very much, actually.
But, in Japan, at the age of 18, high school students take an entrance examination to university. But in England, what would you do?
It doesn't quite work like that. We take O-levels, GCE O-levels at the age of 15 or 16, and then A-levels, that's advanced levels, at the age of about 17 or 18. And those qualify you or not, depending how well you do in them, to enter university. But also you have to take an interview, and they assess you on your headmaster's report and various other criteria like that.
You mentioned GCE. Could you explain what that means?
That's the General Certificate of Education, which is just a way of standardizing the exams all over the country, so that there's some yardstick that everyone can be compared with.
So all English children take this?
Not all children stay at school until the age of 17 or 18. You can leave at the age of 16, I think.
But anyone who is interested in going to university...
Sure, you must.
Take that examination.
You have to take at least... You do it in individual subjects, and you have to have at least 2, sometimes 3, even 4.
And may I ask about your then tertiary education? I'm sure you went to university.
Yes, I studied classics at Cambridge, which was a 3-year course, and I must say it was great fun. It wasn't all study, it was a tremendous time in my life. And classics is a slightly difficult phrase, I think, for people to understand. It means the study of classical civilization, by which I mean Greek and Roman, mostly literature and language, but also philosophy and history and some art.
Well, do you think that the study of the classics in some way helps broaden your knowledge of the English language itself, or what do you think is the relationship between the classics and English?
I think it's not quite crucial, but very helpful. As you know, English came from, well, partly from Latin, and Latin, of course, came from Greek. So one of the ways into English is through the classics. I mean, of course, if you learn the Germanic languages, that's a great help too. But English came mostly from France, and that came from Latin. So it's a great help. Not only the grammar is slightly different, but it has similarities, but the etymology of the words can really help you to understand the meaning of words. Even if you haven't seen the word before, you can look at the various roots and put it together, particularly for scientific words and medical words.
Can you give us some examples of those with Latin origins or Greek origins?
Well, very common word is cinema. That just means something moving. So it's a moving picture. Words like commotion, activity. In English, there are a lot of words which come from the Germanic languages, and then there is a synonym from the classical languages. For example, freedom comes from the German, and liberty comes from the Latin. And they have more or less the same meaning, but just, they come into the language from different roots.
Michael, I imagine the listeners are curious about the Latin root of liberty. Would you mind giving them the Latin word?
Libertas, if I remember rightly. Yes.
And I understand, Michael, that you studied modern languages as well. Could you tell us how you made yourself proficient in French and Italian?
Heavens, I'm not proficient.
Okay, but you still have some knowledge
Yes.
of those languages, I'm sure.
I studied French at school until about the age of 16. And as with many things that you study at school, it's rather theoretical. But I travelled in France 2 or 3 times, and then I studied in France for 1 month. So now I'm afraid my French is very rusty, but at one point it was passable. And Italian also, I never studied Italian actually, but I lived in Italy for 2 years. And Italian is one of those languages that you can pick up, particularly, of course, if you've studied Latin and French and you know some English. It may not be the same for a Japanese person, but it's a very musical language, so I gather it has some similarities to the music of Japanese. So perhaps it wouldn't be too difficult.
Well, you said you lived in Italy for 2 years. What were you doing there?
I was teaching English at private language schools, so that was mostly teaching adults.
Well, can I ask a little more about your teaching experience in Italy, and how do you think Italian students compare with Japanese in terms of their personality or their motivation or whatever?
I think they're very different learners. Admittedly, the kind of situation I was teaching in was slightly different. Whereas in Italy, I was teaching people who paid money in the evenings mostly to go to a language school. So they were highly motivated. But teaching Italians is exhausting. They're very, very lively and active. And they're good. They get excited and they get into a discussion. But if it becomes too interesting, they'll switch into Italian. So you have to raise your voice and shout at them and get them to get back into English. But they're great fun. In Japan, I think my classes are generally larger. But a lot of people say that Japanese students are too quiet. But I think given a bit of time and confidence, they come out with quite good English in the end. You just have to be more patient and let them know that, if they try and don't panic, then...
Excuse me. But while you were in Italy, did you take any formal study of Italian at any institutions?
I didn't actually, no. I just picked it up as I went along. So now I'm afraid my Italian grammar is appalling, and when I speak it's peppered with mistakes.
But still, Italian and French are somewhat related linguistically.
That's right, yes. So, I can get by in an Italian conversation, but you can see people wincing occasionally. And if I were to write a letter, it would be appalling, really.
Well, I'd like you, if you wouldn't mind, to give the listeners some practical hints, if you can, about studying English, since you have taught both to Italians and to Japanese.
Certainly. Well, obviously there's the long, hard slog of study and grammar, but the best way would be to travel to the country, or to one of the countries where it's a native language, preferably to study for a month or more and do homestay. But of course that's not always feasible. There's the problem of time and money. So perhaps more practically, the most important thing I think is to practice. And even with yourself, when I study Japanese, I often practice on my own on the train or in the shower or the bath. And if possible, do this aloud. I mean, some people may think you're a little bit crazy if you suddenly start having a conversation with yourself, but it's a good way of just keeping things moving in your head. Another way is to keep your ears open and your eyes open. In Tokyo, there's an awful lot of exposure to English just from signs and songs and all sorts of things, so be alert.
And is that exactly what you've been doing for the study of Japanese?
Perhaps I'm a bit too lazy, but I've been trying, yes.
One other question I'd like to ask you about this is that Italy and what shall I say, it's a Western culture, so in terms of cultural differences, there are not so many from, perhaps for Italian learners and
that's right,
English speakers, but with Japanese it's a bit different culture. Do you think that's a problem or not?
It's not a major problem. I think it's an advantage for the Italians or any culture that shares roots. And of course linguistically they have a lot in common too. But I mean there's a lot of exposure in Japan to the States and British and Western ways of life. So I don't think that's a real problem. But I suggest one good game is to look at people's slogans on sweatshirts and T-shirts. And you can learn a lot like that. You can also spot the mistakes. There are hundreds of mistakes. So that's fun, I think.
So you mean by spotting mistakes we can learn some correct English?
Yes.
Well, Michael, I'm sorry, but that's all the time we have today. But we'd like to hear more about you and your particularly traveling experiences. So could you come again next week?
I'd be delighted to, yes.
Everyone, this concludes today's guest hour. Be with us next time. Till then, so long.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
担当は東後勝明先生。お相手はベス・ヒギンズさん。今日のゲストはマイケル・バークレイさんでした。英語会話を終わります。
で、皆さん、さよなら。
担当は金田敏夫先生。